And this is our kickoff event for our new Black Lives Matter lecture and discussion series. And tonight we have, we're talking about fragile democracy, the struggle over race and voting rights in North Carolina. And we have leading our discussion is the author Pamela Grundy, who has written about Charlotte High School, Color and Character, West Charlotte High School, and the American Struggle over Educational Equality. These are the two titles that our authors have written. And Pamela is going to take over, but welcome to the library. And I hope you'll join us every month on the second Thursday at 6:30 and hear our authors. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rachel. I mean, it's a great honor to be invited to do a library program because y'all do so much marvelous historical work, both through programs, through archives, exhibits. I mean, it's the library deserves all the accolades it's had. So it's great to be here. It's also wonderful to be here because I'm able to spend time with two of my mentors. Dr. Jim Aludis, Dr. Bob Korstad were at UNC in Chapel Hill when I was a graduate student decades ago. I won't say how many. Really, I have always been so impressed by both what cool people they are, but also with their dedication to the state of North Carolina and the importance of understanding the lessons of its history. I TA'd Jim's North Carolina history class. It was a formative experience. Might have seemed like that to you, Jim, but it really was. And Jim and Bob have examined subjects that range, all of North Carolina's post-Civil War history. They've studied and written award-winning work on textile mill culture, the modernization of North Carolina's education system, unionization among African-American tobacco workers, anti-poverty efforts in the 1960s, and on and on. And tonight we're going to talk about their latest work, which is, as Rachel pointed out, Fragile Democracy, the Struggle Over Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina. It's a tremendously important book that in some ways sums up a lot of their decades of commitment to the state. They trace the various roles that race has played in state politics since the end of the Civil War, and there are a lot of those, as well as the consequences of the centrality of race to the state, a story which is, of course, profoundly relevant today. I'm going to start the discussion by telling a story of my own. One thing I learned at Chapel Hill was it's all about stories. It's all about people's experiences, and that's one of the things I think that Jim and Bob really do well is bringing the experience of actually, they're not like ivory tower scholars who philosophize about abstract concepts. Their work is really grounded in the experience of North Carolinians. So here's my story. A little bit over a week ago, Wednesday, it's 7 a.m. Seattle time, 10 a.m. North Carolina time. I got on a plane to come back to North Carolina. And the news when I boarded the plane was that Georgia had just elected the first African-American senator ever. It was this remarkable event. And that's what I boarded the plane thinking. We fly for 5 hours across the country, land in Charlotte about 3:15, and I, like everybody else, even before they tell you can, I turn my phone on to check the news, and white supremacists have invaded the Capitol and are rampaging through the building. And my head spun. But as Fragile Democracy, this book makes clear, this is actually part of a pretty familiar pattern in North Carolina history and in our nation's history. And so I'm going to start by asking you, Jim and Bob, to place that, that juxtaposition, that great gains by African Americans in Georgia with this violent action by who are essentially white supremacists. So,
well, thanks, Pam, and thanks for that nice introduction. It's great to be here with you tonight. And Rachel's off the screen, but we're grateful for the invitation. So Bob and I were talking a lot about this last Wednesday. I mean, I think our thoughts went immediately, as did the thoughts of many other observers who know North Carolina's history, back to the late 1890s and to the Wilmington coup in 1898. And the parallels are chilling. What you had seen in North Carolina was the formation of a progressive biracial alliance that had gained control of both the state legislature and the governor's office, had embarked on a program of quite remarkable kind of social and political reform. And their opponents, the tactics seemed very familiar as you looked in the rearview mirror, poured enormous energy into developing the perception of widespread voter fraud, persuaded the majority of whites that violence and the removal of blacks from politics was the only way to restore election integrity and what they called good government. And of course, where this led eventually was to black disenfranchisement in 1900 in North Carolina and the institutionalization of the regime of Jim Crow. It's a sobering reminder. We talk a lot about American exceptionalism. This is another reminder to be very careful about that. Our story is not one of steady upward progress, but there have been many dark moments like the one in Wilmington and like the one we're living through.
Bob, do you want to talk a little bit about Wilmington? And I mean, because that is this, again, example of the invasion of the public sphere. And you want to tell us just a little bit about that?
Bob, you're muted.
We're not hearing you, Bob.
Yes, thanks. So Wilmington was a pretty exceptional town in the late 19th century in many ways. It was a very vibrant city, had a large African-American population, a strong middle class. It's a newspaper, lots of churches. It had a biracial city government. It had African Americans employed in all kinds of jobs that we wouldn't think about today, and so it was really a kind of a beacon in the state for what could have come out of Reconstruction, what could have come out at the end of the 19th century in terms of biracial politics and the opportunities that were available both to blacks and whites. And of course, that was challenging to white elites, particularly the alliances that were made throughout North Carolina during the late 19th century, the fusion movement, in which white populists and black and white Republicans came together. Were able to win over the state legislature, the governor's house, governor's mansion, and pass some of the most progressive social legislation in North Carolina's history. And so it was that kind of combination that really sparked the coup d'etat, in which white elites, with the help of red shirts, earlier kind of MAGA types that were able to overthrow violently the city government, killing dozens of African Americans in the process. So it was a real an American tragedy in every sense of the word.
Yeah, and this idea of people in just, these are in Wilmington, people who the city government had been elected fair and square. They had mayor and other people who had been elected democratically. And then this group of armed, angry white men stormed through the city and essentially set themselves up as the leaders, although they had never been elected. I mean, it's you hate to say, but something of what some of the people who invaded the Capitol might have liked to have happened. I mean, that would be something they would look back and say, well, we didn't quite get that far. But it's, from Wilmington in 1898 to 2021, that's 120 years. Can you talk a little bit about why hasn't more changed, or what makes it possible that you could see both Black advancement and then white supremacist effort to deny that 120 years, almost 200 years after the Civil War, almost 120 years after Wilmington?
Yeah, well, that's a great big question, and we can kind of peel the onion a little bit here.
Jim.
Yeah, yeah. But it is a chance to say that what we chart, in this book is a cyclic pattern, historical pattern in North Carolina. From the one hand, what we call emancipatory politics, which has been about expanding access to the ballot box, and not just access to the right to vote, but that's come with also a more expansive vision of the role of the state, of our responsibilities to one another as citizens, and the role of government in helping us exercise that responsibility to invest in one another's lives and to advance human flourishing. So these periods of emancipatory politics and what's paired in every instance, and we're living through it now, is periods of conservative retrenchment, which have been about putting up barriers to the ballot box, but it's also been connected to a much narrower vision, sort of the rights of citizenship, our responsibilities to one another. It's been the impulse in North Carolina that's been about small government, about low taxation, and even lower wages, and some of the kind of chronic poverty that has plagued the state through so much of its history. But I'll hand this off to Bob. But I think one of the other kind of through lines has been the centrality of the leadership of the agency of Black North Carolinians in sort of driving the process of reform forward, and really pushing this state to kind of fulfill the promise of American democracy.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that somewhat surprised us, but was really engaging as we were working on this book. Because most people think of the Jim Crow era, the period from Wilmington to the Civil Rights Movement, or even later, as a kind of a dark period in which nothing really changed. It was very static. Jim Crow was ruled supreme. And what you find is that, very early on, certainly shortly after the end of World War I, African Americans they're organizing, they're starting to think politically, they're strategizing. Does it make sense to stay in the Republican Party, or do we try to infiltrate the party of democracy, the Democratic Party, the party of white supremacy, and fight from within? It involves African American tobacco workers in a place that I studied, Winston-Salem, who in the 1940s conduct a voter registration drive to put thousands of people on the registration rolls, and help select the first African American alderman who won an election against a white person in the South since the late 19th century. We found this very determined lawyer, James Walker, first class of Black lawyers at UNC, who put up a decade-long fight in Eastern North Carolina to get people registered to vote. And so I think that's one of the really important things to understand is even though these cycles continue to happen, that always within this conservative retrenchment is the preparation and the hope for another round of emancipatory politics. And, you know, we're thinking we're in a kind of a situation like that right now. You know, it's very unclear where North Carolina is going in the future, but you know, it's something to look back over time and kind of think about how that history might play itself out today.
Well, and I think that raises a question about, again, the roles of African Americans in American politics, not just here in North Carolina, but nationally as well. I mean, in many ways, African American voters, activists have been at the forefront of what you might call emancipatory politics.
Absolutely.
The politics of openness, of you know, basically opening the process up to everyone. Why has that been? I mean, this is for, you know, even if you look today, this has been for, you know, ever since the Civil War or even before.
Yeah, it's certainly been the pattern. I mean, if you go back to right after the Civil War, and you look at North Carolina's Constitution, which was framed by this kind of biracial alliance we're describing, and people should go pull a copy off the shelf or Google it and read it. It's quite extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
It establishes government for the good of all. I mean, that's their words, right? Not our characterization. One of the unique things about this Constitution, and it's proving to be interesting in state court, is the Constitution in the state guarantees free and fair elections. And I think the point here, and is something we really underscore in the book, is that while Black North Carolinians, Black Americans have fought for their right to vote, to participate in government, they've not done it just for themselves, but they have done it for the good of us all. And so, when you understand things in that way, it really does bring, as I try to say to my students when we're studying these things, it's really easy, I think, given the world we're in, they'll tend to try to put things in boxes. Well, that's Black history and that's somebody else's history. And but to help them understand that this may be African American history, but this is American history, right? This is the story of us all.
I think one of the really important things too here is that one of the goals of disenfranchisement in the late at the turn of the century was to take away the ability of Black men to vote, but in doing so, it also marginalized and silenced moderate whites and whites who had, progressive politics and wanted to had a different vision of the state. And so it's really, these moments in which, African Americans become more engaged and very involved in the political process. And we can look in the 1960s, the 1990s, early 2000s. You can look at it at Georgia last week. It opens, it gives opportunities for it's like 35-40% of the white population that doesn't agree with the conservative politics of white supremacy. And so I think that's one of the really important lessons that we've drawn from this experience. And it played out in Georgia last week. It just, that was, you had all those white people who didn't have much of a voice. And with the large number of African Americans, at the polls, then everybody's options increased.
You flip this around, I think you can distill it into a single phrase, and that is, the struggle to establish and reestablish white supremacy, has not been just the struggle to impose white rule, but to also determine, as Bob's suggesting, which whites would rule supreme, right? So kind of struggles over class in North Carolina and the story of the South and in the United States, is have always been tangled up with these issues of race.
Talk a little bit more about that, Jim.
Well, wow. I mean, that goes all the way back. I mean, I'm going to go back before we start our book, but it goes all the way back to the arrival of the first African slaves, in North America in 1619. There's an extraordinary book, what Bob, I guess is 50 years old almost now, Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom. And he's looking at Virginia. And at the kind of crisis that began to emerge early in the 17th century as white indentured servants, served out their indenture, they moved into the back country. They began to try to establish, homesteads of their own. And there's increasing political and economic conflict with the large tobacco planters who dominate the economy and dominate politics. And if you know Virginia's history in the mid 17th century, there's almost civil war there. And then Dutch traders bring in African slaves, and it takes a while, but you create this new institution. I think it's really important not just to say the word slavery, but of racial slavery. And in effect, those men who controlled Virginia made a bargain with lower class whites, by connecting skin color to freedom. That no matter how low they might sink economically or politically, they could be assured that what Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness, there would always be someone beneath them, and that person would be black. Well, again, I mean, that's a story, we're looking at during the era of Reconstruction in the late 1890s, the middle of the 20th century. And in fact, I think you can argue that's still, the fundamental storyline today.
Well, that really comes to, something that people have talked about a lot, particularly this year with Black Lives Matter, and just sort of bringing to the fore the roles that race has played in our society. And people talk a lot about systematic racism, and that being a fundamental component of American society. How does that idea of systematic racism play into this cycle, as you talk about, of gains for African Americans and by extension for other folks who are not at the top of society, and just how that works out?
Yeah, well, wow, that's a big question. I think
y'all taught me to ask these questions. Let me just say, I'm your student. Right. You taught me this.
Yeah, I mean, systematic, racism, it's embedded in educational opportunities, embedded in structures of work. It's embedded in all kinds of privileges that some people, based on skin color or class and stuff, have, and other people don't have. And those things, once people become acculturated to them. And I'm just think about how hard it was to break down the racial division of labor in the South. Say just in the textile industry, which is a lily white institution for many years. How that seemed natural that white people worked there and black people didn't work there. But yet, the civil rights movement and the efforts to try to break down that type of institutional segregation changed things overnight. There wasn't anything natural about segregation. There was no reason blacks and whites couldn't work together. There was no reason African Americans couldn't do all the same jobs that whites were working. So I think when racism and kind of racial thinking gets structured into our society, whether it's in politics or economics, education, housing. It's very difficult to overcome, to break those kind of patterns and stuff. And we're certainly seeing that today. I mean, if you look at issues of affordable housing and education and stuff. I mean, the way in which governmental programs that created this segregation, it's still there. It's very hard to overcome.
And it seems like, oh, go ahead, Jim.
But no, I was to go back to a word Bob or used at the beginning, to education. I mean, you see this kind of systemic structural racism, I think, in historical understanding and certainly in historical memory. I mean, it's when Bob and I teach this material, we're always struck. Bob's students at Duke, mine at Chapel Hill. I mean, these students have had very good educations. And we begin, talking about what happened in the late 19th century, talking about that story that Bob was describing, in the mid 20th century, and their eyes are out on stalks. And a few classes in, a lot of them are mad.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they come to office hours and I don't understand how this happened. I had a very good education. How is it that I don't know this stuff? And part of what they're mad about is they begin to understand how cramped their imaginations are because they understand so little of the past. I mean, history is not just about the past. It's about this moment and about the future. And having this kind of understanding, really just enlarges your capacity to imagine what's possible in the world. I could go on for this for a while, but I'm co-chairing this new commission on history, race, and a way forward at UNC, and part of the thing we're working on is, names on the landscape. The names that are there, if you go look even at things written recently, it's amazing how entrenched lost cause ideology is. And of course, the names, and we know more and more of them now, of the hundreds of enslaved people who built and maintained the campus.
Well, I think
you walk around campus all day and have no sense of that history is there.
Right. I mean, having walked around that campus many years, having walked past Silent Sam, for more years than I like to think, and not really thinking anything of it. I mean, I know exactly that mentality. But I think so one of the questions then would be, I mean, a lot of people are talking now about how what we're seeing today is the result of not really dealing with these issues back when they were first most intensely raised right after the Civil War, that they just weren't dealt with, they were not resolved. And so you have, I mean, essentially race becomes something, and I was talking earlier about this with some folks, it's kind of this piece in your political toolbox. And from the end, well, really probably even from before the Civil War to today, it's always there. It's something that a politician can reach in and grab and put to certain ends. I mean, what's that about?
Jim, you've got a great story about that you were just been looking at with Hamilton and the kind of the writing, kind of starting to thinking right away what Reconstruction and stuff was about.
Yeah, I've been writing a little bit about Joseph Hamilton, for whom Hamilton Hall on UNC is named. He was a historian, founder of the Southern Historical Collection, the most important archival collection of its kind anywhere. But wrote about Reconstruction, and his work is just a great reminder of the way that what we've never had in this country is a real reckoning, an honest reckoning with slavery and its legacy. Hamilton's work basically made the case that slavery was done away with, that exposed what he saw as the kind of inherent indolence and criminality of blacks, so that their resubjugation became necessary. I mean, it's, coming back to the story I was telling earlier
quote,
about
unquote,
seeing
right?
seeing that as necessary to good government. But we've never had, a reckoning with the past. I play a kind of trick on my students sometimes when we're talking about this, and, ask them how many have seen the new Emancipation Monument in Washington. All right. And of course, they can't figure out it is. And of course, the museum is there now, and it is of sorts. But, or why don't they celebrate Emancipation Day every January? I'm sorry, losing my earbuds here. They're struck by the notion that, wow, you would think that a republic founded on the notion of human equality would have two holy civic days, one July the 4th and the other January the 1st. Why is the latter one not there? You see evidence of that, I think, also in the question of reparations. And, as soon as you see the word, you hear the word, there's the reflex. Oh, nope, can't do that. It's too expensive. Well, I don't know what the answer is on the other side, but wouldn't it be interesting if we had the conversation in this country, right? If we could stop the reflex long enough to have the conversation and to have the honest reckoning. It's long overdue, and we suffer in its absence.
Do you see anything happening, particularly here in North Carolina, to address the way this gets left out of students' education? Folks who don't have the privilege of going to college and being in a specific, classes. It's not like every college class teaches this either. I mean, do you see change happening at all, or any push? And if so, what's kind of driven that?
Well, I think there's, I think over the last few years in particular, in the last few years with Black Lives Matter, we're talking about that, has raised a lot of people's awareness. I mean, I think that there are a lot more people who know about Wilmington than used to, and not just through taking Jim's class, but just some our high school teachers, our middle school teachers, as you've worked with a lot, Pam, are starting to teach that and starting to try to think about what a different North Carolina looks like. I think the taking down monuments makes, whatever you think about it, it makes people think about, well, why were they up there in the first place? Who were those people? What did they represent? Why should we be rethinking the role that they played in our state? I think, in North Carolina, I think the Moral Monday movement, the reaction to the conservative takeover of state government, I think has played a big role in exposing people to kind of biracial politics and biracial alliances, and the importance of Black leadership and white people following Black leaders. So I think there's a lot going on in this, been going on in this state over the last decade, even in a very conservative environment politically. That is going to be interesting to see where that goes, and I think it's reached a lot deeper than most people think.
And we will soon have a freedom monument in Raleigh, and I think that's a huge move. But a lot of it is on us as well. I mean, the three of us sitting here in our profession, and the importance of. I think too often we write books to one another and not to a broad audience. And we've tried. Readers will decide. But what we've tried with Freedom Democracy Fragile Democracy really is to write a book that is to and for the people of North Carolina first and foremost.
And I'll just say one thing: if you go to our website, fragiledemocracy.com, right? There's a fabulous exhibit on there, with photographs and images and stuff, and that really takes you through the argument of the book. I think in in a way that makes it accessible to anybody in North Carolina. So there's no reason anymore for people to plead ignorance, I think. I mean, given all the kind of resources at our disposal.
Well, and I think, I will say, yes, it's a beautiful website, and it really, particularly if you're teaching North Carolina history or teaching American history, it really gets the main ideas across in a very just bright and effective, and there's a lot of visuals. It's just terrific. So I highly recommend that. And in the comments, they put the link to that. But one of the questions, and I think this is really significant. I mean, we talk about the progress that's happened in North Carolina. Some monuments have come down. We have people teaching about this. There's, Wilmington is more known. And yet in 2020, Georgia was the southern state that broke out of the, frankly, white supremacist mold and did not vote for Donald Trump, and then elected two Democratic, anti-white supremacist senators, one of whom was African American. And I think if you'd asked before that, I mean, there's a reason Donald Trump came to North Carolina 9 times and didn't go to Georgia 9 times, or however many times he came. I mean, the expectation was that North Carolina, if there was a southern state that would, where the Democrats could break through, as Barack Obama did in 2008, that it would be North Carolina. And North Carolina, and why didn't that happen?
And we arrogant North Carolinians would never have bet that it would be Georgia that would lead us out of the wilderness, right?
Uh-huh.
Bob, you want to start with a shot at that one?
Well, I'll just say a couple of things. One is, Georgia has a pretty significantly larger African American population than North Carolina. I mean, 30+%, and we're at 20 something. So I think that's one issue here. It's North Carolina still in a lot of ways is a more rural state. I mean, the kind of power of Atlanta and the metropolitan area and the kind of people it attracts, I think is significant. I mean, if you look at voting patterns in North Carolina, what the way people vote in Charlotte and Raleigh-Durham, is very different from the way they vote in other places. I think there's a lot of, there's also a lot of suffering in North Carolina and hardship that I think people are having a very difficult time figuring out who is causing that, and so politicians say, well, it's the immigrants that are coming here, or it's the liberals or the socialists or something. And, if your wages are some of the lowest in the nation, it's not, you need to figure out why that's happening, or if unemployment's, benefits are the lowest in the nation, or if the healthcare system is not responsive to your needs. I mean, I think there needs to be a lot more awareness and discussion, in North Carolina about, what it is that's driving a lot of the factors that are that, quite frankly, are making people very very uncertain about their future.
And the great kind of hope and despair in the story of these issues in this state is that the difference between choosing one path and the other has always been very, very slim. When people would ask about this years ago, it would be people would ask, well, how in the world did you have Jesse Helms and Terry Sanford in the Senate at the same time? Well, that's North Carolina.
Yeah.
If you look back to Reconstruction, the larger percentage of whites in any other Southern state crossed the race line, into the Republican Party. If you look at the late 19th century, it's the only state where that fusion alliance took control of state of state government. But with, the kind of politics we've been talking about, you move just a few votes one way or the other, and the result is profoundly different. I mean, the other thing here is, Georgia has Stacey Abrams, and I think that really, she has proved the power of the kind of long haul ground game. And there are great people and great organizations in this state doing exactly that kind of work, and understand the importance of knocking on people's doors, not 2 weeks before the election, but 2 years before the election.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the thing that all of us can do, if we really want to advance democracy in this state, is to find out who those folks are statewide and in our local communities, and get involved and support them with both our time, and to the degree we're able to do so, with our treasure as well. It's hard work, and it doesn't happen just in the months running up to a presidential election every 4 years.
Right. No, I think you're correct. I think you certainly see with, again, Obama's victory in 2000, that kind of work got done. That kind of money got spent, that kind of work got done. But let me just throw out a thought of mine related to this. I mean, have liberals, again, and we're talking about, basically, liberals and Democrats and electing liberals to office, have people been complacent with the idea that North Carolina's on the verge and it doesn't maybe take that much work?
That's a good question. I
haven't really thought of that one.
I mean, I think a lot of people were surprised at the turnout of Republicans and the turnout of Trump voters in North Carolina. The kind of percent, if you look at the percentage of registered Republicans who voted, it's higher than Democrats or independents. I don't know if they took it for granted that it was, things are going to be better, but I think that there was probably not as much awareness of the divides in North Carolina. If kind of thinking about, why does the Sandhills in Robeson County in northeastern North Carolina, which has some of the highest poverty in North Carolina, and in some of the counties and precincts in the country, those areas in the state went overwhelmingly Republican, both at the presidential level and others. And I think there's some fabulous groups who are out who are working in small towns and rural areas, who kind of figured that out. But it's, as Jim said, you don't do that in 1 year. That's a 5-year project. And so we may see very different kind of results 4 years from now. I don't know.
No, I mean, I think that's a good point. I do want to, at this point, say there is time for questions from the audience. So if you do have questions for Bob or Jim, please do put them in the comments, and we will try to answer them. Anyway, but ask some questions. I've got lots of questions, but we'd love to hear from you as well for that. And just getting back, so I'll open up another subject. Okay, the three of us are historians. We're trained historians. We've all won lots of prizes and things like that. I mean, we're respected, and we're all wearing our politics on our sleeve tonight. I think it's that we are not the historians who are sitting back and saying, "Well, history says this," and and that's that. We're clearly all focused on the expansion of the vote, the value of government really taking a role and looking out for everybody. What would you say to people who say, well, that's really not a historian's job?
Jim, you have to answer that.
Yeah, wow. I start class every year with sort of a version of this. I think there are a number of answers. First of all, history is a conversation between the past and the present. And the other thing I do with students is, ask them to think about what the word objective means. Because, when we're just kind of brainstorming about history and what historians do, that'll always come up. And what does that mean? And a lot of them will say, well, that means that you have no politics. You separate your study of the past from politics. And then we begin to think about that a little bit. It seems to me that if you have no politics, that is, you have no sort of take on the world, I don't know how you would generate an interesting question about the past. Mm-hmm. So I think, being objective, it's about the conversation. This is, even what we're doing here tonight, this is always open and contingent, and challenge is really important. And that's how we sort of grow and develop and shape our understanding of the past and the work it can help us do, in the present and in the future. And again, it's that conversation. It's not about a kind of chronicle that you roll up and put in grandma's attic once it's all done. But being a historian is trying to illuminate really hard questions about the present, with some understanding gained by looking at the past, by looking back at those moments when we made big decisions about following one path or another. And sometimes you may look back and say, thank God we didn't go that way. Mm-hmm. But we were talking about this a little bit earlier. Other times you may look and say, wow, I had no idea that was, and this is what happens to students when we're doing this work on the late 19th century. I had no idea, of the kind of alternative that was left behind. There might be something to learn from that about the way we want to live now and tomorrow.
You've been talking about how I've asked you really big questions, and I'm gonna ask a bigger one now.
Here's the windup. Okay.
Well, it's a. So y'all have both studied North Carolina history for decades and decades and decades
and decades
and decades. How has that affected you? How have your decades of studying the past influenced who you are and how you think about the present?
Well, I think I think I know and understand a lot more about what's going on today because of the work that I've done as an individual. Jim and I have done, other colleagues have done, your books that I've read. Other people. I think I can't imagine trying to think about today without knowing about all these things that we've been writing about. I can't think about. I don't know how I would think about today if I didn't. If this whole notion of kind of cyclical history that we're talking about, kind of emancipatory politics and conservative retrenchment. That to me is a really important way of framing and thinking about how, the ebb and flow of history in North Carolina. And also I think that the historians of this state have just done, for many, many, many years, have done a fabulous job of understanding this, trying to understand the state, but also connect what's going on in North Carolina to things that are going on in other parts of the country and to the nation at large. I think I feel very fortunate to have been part of a group of people who have studied this state so intensively.
Jim, you're born and raised here.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
Were you born in Oklahoma? I did not know
Greensboro.
that.
I was born in Raleigh, but I grew up in Greensboro.
We have surnames that don't give it away.
Yeah,
yeah.
Greek and Norwegian,
Yeah.
surnames. But
well, I think I'd say a lot of, along the lines Bob has described. I mean, I think I probably as a citizen feel a stronger sense of agency, because understanding gives you that ability to, I think, to engage the contemporary world in a way that you might not otherwise be able to do with it provides some real kind of clarity and discernment. I think it reminds me every day of how important the agency of other North Carolinians is, and the agency of other North Carolinians who are not history professors, and who are not talking heads on events like this. But often in times it would seem so inauspicious. It's back to what we were talking about earlier. Some of the things we were talking about earlier have had such extraordinary kind of positive impact on the history and trajectory of life in North Carolina.
One of the questions, I think just to say a minute, for me, who was not born and raised in North Carolina, just studying the past, people are just amazing. It is just amazing what people in the past have done. The workers in Winston-Salem, the African-American women who fought for the right for them to vote, as well as white women, the leaders who joined up in these multicultural, multiracial coalitions, and who braved violence and threats to carry through. It really is. It's remarkable, and it's heartening to think, to know that there are people doing that today, and that we should, all of us be supporting that and supporting them and doing what we can. The past just opens up so much. We have a question here from someone who's on Facebook asking another big question. I'm not the only one with big questions. What would you say is the most important thing we can do today to help end systematic racism?
Whoa. Well, I'll just say a couple of things that come to mind on that. I think one is really trying to understand what systematic racism and the roots of it are, and how it works itself out in the institutions and the relationships we have. One of the projects I've been working on for the last few years is looking at the history of inequality in Durham, and we've done an incredible project, a public history project, looking at housing and education and foodways and stuff, in which we've gone back and really looked at, okay, here inequality based on race and income, socioeconomic status exists in Durham, the town we're studying today. And it looks like this. So where'd that come from? This didn't just start yesterday, but there are deep roots in the way the neighborhoods were laid out. The ways the neighborhoods where they planted trees in the 1930s versus the neighborhoods they didn't plant trees. Even small things like that. So I think trying to study and understand the world we live in today and how it got to be what it is. And then the other thing is, I think finding ways of engaging other people, maybe even people that don't agree, in conversations about this. So it's not, we try to do that as much as we can. So it becomes an engagement, not only with the past, but other people, and you're kind of working collectively and to think about that. So that's a couple things.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, Bob. And then trying to just think about how you translate that into, the kind of small interactions on a daily basis. I think one of the really hard things here, and especially at a moment like this, is not to just be so overwhelmed that you become paralyzed and can't act. Again, it's back to that point about agency. The world has changed to some degree by individual figures, but largely by the small incremental ways that ordinary people live their day-to-day lives and interact with one another.
We all are part of history in that sense.
And people make history. It doesn't just happen.
People make history. Absolutely. People make history. We're coming down to the end now. So I really just want to ask you, again, going back to the book, there's so much in it, and you say a lot of important things. We've covered a few here. Is there any lasting, or any final idea that you'd like to emphasize that's in the book that you want to make sure that people don't forget about? We may have talked about it or not, but what's the most important thing besides actually buying it? Which I highly recommend. I mean, this kind of thing, it's really worth reading. But what do you really want people to take away from? I'll let you go first, Jim.
I'm trying to think of sort of something new to say, but given the conversation, given the conversation we just had, I would hope that people would read this book and would put it down with an enlarged sense of their understanding and their capacity to make a real contribution to making change, sort of little d democratic change in this state and nation. Yeah. I think that would be the aspiration for the book.
Yeah, I think one other thing is that Jim and I have been talking about this a lot recently is, where does North Carolina go from here? And I think one of the things in this book is that we don't have to just dream it up. We don't have to be theoretical about, what does North Carolina's future look like? I mean, I think we've got some really important moments in the past where people kind of laid out, whether it was in the 1868 Constitution, in the fusion legislation, and the demands of Black tobacco workers, and the North Carolina Fund that Terry Sanford created. There are all kinds of moments in North Carolina's past that give us ideas and examples of the way way society can be organized so that it benefits larger numbers of people. And we have a place where we don't have the kinds of divisions and the kinds of inequalities and equities that kind of exist. So, I mean, I think you can get some really good ideas about where we need to go from just looking at this pretty thin volume about North Carolina's past.
Well, and I think making the point, it's about race and democracy and voting rights. And I think, again, just for me, what I hope people will take away is that this question of African-American participation, since the end of the Civil War really has been not just about whether Black people get to participate, but about this larger vision of is government, is the state really looking out for the interests of everyone as opposed to the interests of a limited, often elite group of people who are white. They're white, but not, again, getting back to what you said, not people rule, but which white people should rule. I just think that is so important when we think of a vision of how do we make North Carolina thrive. And I think this book really helps in understanding that. So we're coming down to the end. Rachel was going to come back to say thank you from the library. And here she is. Rachel, Thanks so much, Jim and Bob. This is great.
Thank you.
Rachel, take it
Thanks,
away.
Pam. This was great fun to be with you tonight.
Yeah,
Same here.
always great.
Rachel, thank you.
Thank you, guys. I really want to say thanks from the library. I want to hold up your books again, Fragile Democracy, The Struggle Over Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina, and Pamela Grundy's book is Color and Character, West Charlotte High and the American Struggle Over Educational Quality. I certainly encourage people to buy the books. If buying a book is not something you can do right now, please come to the library and get it from us. We've got copies. They're both—
Reading is the most important. Buying is good,
Yeah.
but reading is the most important.
These are academic authors, but the work is not academic reading. It's very readable. It's really enlightening. It's wonderful reading. And to anybody who's watching, to people who registered, I'll send a link to the online exhibit for Fragile Democracy. It's a really wonderful visual exhibit that you can scroll through. And I would ask everybody to come back the second Thursday of every month and see who we have for our Black Lives Matter discussion and lecture series. Next month, it is the authors and illustrators of I Am Every Good Thing, Derek Barnes and Gordon James. And I just want to thank you so much for coming, and I hope that we can have you come back.
Thank you.
Anytime,
Thanks.
Rachel. Thanks to the library for promoting such great discussions.
Yep. Thanks.
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 Good night,
Good
everyone.
night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Good night. Stay safe.